I lived in an apartment that had been constructed during the late 1970s or early 1980s. Once a prestigious property, it had since fallen into disrepair, its glory days long past. The building housed a diverse population, and it stood on uneven terrain that bore a dark history, land that had once belonged to Native Americans and was marred by violent skirmishes and deaths. Initially, I resided in a midsection unit on the second floor, conveniently close to the management office. My time there was relatively uneventful, save for the mouse infestation that gnawed at my peace of mind. However, when I spotted my first roach, it was the final straw. The mere sight of the vile creature pushed me to seek an alternative. The office staff, perhaps sensing my frustration, offered me an apartment at the far end of the building. It was a corner unit on the third floor with newly added furnishings. This opportunity was too good to pass up. I had always dreamed of living on the top floor, especially in a corner unit, where I imagined I'd be free of noisy neighbors stomping overhead. How naive I was. At first, the move seemed like a blessing. The new apartment was quieter, the roaches were nowhere to be seen, and the mouse issue was considerably less severe. However, things took a dark turn, and eventually, the mice drove me to break my lease, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It began innocuously enough. My partner at the time, who is now my wife, and I started noticing an odd occurrence: footsteps. Every day, we would hear the distinct sound of footsteps above us. This puzzled us, as we lived on the top floor. These steps weren't random either, they seemed to follow us. If we moved from the bedroom to the living room, the footsteps followed. When we settled down for the night, they did the same, pacing in circles in the corners of our rooms before stopping. I tried to rationalize the phenomenon. Perhaps someone was hiding in the attic space beneath the slanted roof. But why would they choose our unit to shadow? Moreover, if I were hiding, I'd take great care not to make noise. This theory, while plausible, didn't hold up under scrutiny. As time passed, it became clear that the sound was coming not just from above but within the confines of our apartment. It was a chilling realization. I eventually concluded that we were sharing our home with a spirit. My partner, rooted in her spiritual beliefs, preferred to ignore it, dismissing it as harmless unless it posed a direct threat. I, however, welcomed the paranormal. Having once aspired to join the clergy and specialize in exorcisms, I had a natural curiosity for such phenomena. Though I ultimately chose family life over priesthood, I retained a strong connection to the spiritual realm. Over the years, I had honed a gift of discernment, which allowed me to perceive hidden truths, glimpse the past, and even foresee fragments of the future. These abilities, combined with occasional experiences of remote viewing, lent me a unique perspective on the supernatural. Through my mind's eye, I began to see the entity that haunted us. He was a white man in his mid to late 20s, his appearance disheveled yet familiar. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, his beard framing a face etched with weariness. This figure would follow us from room to room, his movements deliberate and unsettling. Strangest of all, he seemed to defy gravity, walking upside down on the ceiling. After pacing in circles, he would settle cross-legged in a corner, watching us silently as we went about our lives. The haunting reached its peak one evening when my partner was away. Alone in bed, I began to drift off when an alarming sensation jolted me awake. My bed was shaking. At first, I tried to attribute the tremor to external factors. Perhaps the vibrations were caused by a distant train, though such disturbances were usually faint and rare. But as the shaking intensified, I grew uneasy. I adjusted my position, hoping it was merely a pinched nerve causing an illusion. Yet, the bed continued to tremble with increasing vigor. Recognizing the possibility of a spiritual disturbance, I turned to prayer. Reciting the Our Father, I hoped to banish whatever force was causing the chaos. The shaking persisted for another 30 seconds after I finished the prayer, then ceased abruptly, leaving me in an eerie stillness. I called my partner, asking if she could return for the night. To my relief, she agreed but shared an unsettling story of her own. That evening, upon returning to her home, she had encountered an inexplicable barrier. Her bedroom door, though locked, refused to open. She struggled against it with all her strength, but the handle wouldn't budge. Alarmed, she enlisted her grandmother's help. Her grandmother, a spiritually adept and wise woman, exerted considerable effort before the door finally gave way. The timing of this incident, coinciding with my own harrowing experience, was too uncanny to dismiss as coincidence. When my partner arrived, her presence was a balm to my frazzled nerves. That night, with her by my side, I finally felt at peace, though the events of that day left an indelible mark on both of us. Even now, as I recount these occurrences, I can't help but wonder about the restless spirit that once shared our home, pacing endlessly in its search for something only it could understand. The unease that lingered after that night never fully dissipated. The footsteps continued, their movements now almost routine. As unnerving as it was, my partner and I began to adapt to the presence, treating it as an uninvited but predictable houseguest. Yet, there was always a tension in the air, a feeling that the spirit's intentions were far from benign. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the entity's presence became undeniable. The atmosphere grew heavy, almost suffocating, and the temperature dropped sharply. I could feel a weight settle over the room, as though I were being watched with an intensity that burned into the back of my skull. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a low, guttural sound emanated from the corner where the spirit typically perched. Summoning my courage, I decided to confront it. I spoke aloud, my voice steady but firm. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting momentarily. For a brief second, I thought I had scared it off, but then the room plunged into darkness as every light simultaneously went out. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight. When I finally managed to illuminate the room, I saw it. A shadowy figure stood in the corner, its form indistinct yet menacing. It wasn't the man I had envisioned in my mind's eye, this was something darker, more primal. Its presence exuded malevolence, and I realized that whatever this was, it had been masking its true nature all along. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow and my legs trembling. The figure didn't move, but its dark silhouette seemed to pulse as though it were feeding off my fear. Desperately, I began to pray, reciting every protection prayer I could remember. The shadow seemed to writhe in response, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness. When my partner returned that night, I recounted the experience in vivid detail. She listened carefully, her expression grave. Her grandmother's teachings had prepared her for encounters with malevolent entities, and she decided it was time to take action. The next day, she brought her grandmother to the apartment, armed with holy water, sage, and prayers. Her grandmother began the cleansing ritual by walking through the apartment, sprinkling holy water and muttering prayers in a language I didn't recognize. The air grew thick with the scent of sage as she burned it, the smoke curling into every corner of the rooms. When she reached the bedroom, she paused, her gaze fixed on the corner where the footsteps always seemed to settle. She whispered something to my partner, who turned to me with a look of alarm. "She says the spirit isn't alone," my partner translated. "There's something darker here, something that was never human." A chill ran down my spine. Her grandmother's prayers grew louder, more forceful, as though she were locked in battle with an unseen foe. The air in the room seemed to vibrate, and a sudden gust of wind blew through the apartment, extinguishing the sage. The room fell silent, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. "It's not gone," her grandmother said, her voice firm but laced with concern. "It's attached to this place, perhaps even to the land itself. You must leave. Staying here will only invite further harm." The gravity of her words struck me, and I realized that this was a battle we couldn't win. That night, my partner and I began making plans to move out. It wasn't an easy decision. Financially, it was a strain, and finding a new place on short notice was daunting. But the alternative, remaining in a place tainted by such darkness, was unthinkable. In the days that followed, the activity escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own, objects were moved or thrown across the room, and the footsteps became more erratic and aggressive. One night, I woke to find deep scratches etched into the bedroom wall, marks that hadn't been there the evening before. It was as though the entity was lashing out, angry at our decision to leave. When moving day finally arrived, I felt a mix of relief and dread. As we packed the last of our belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was watching us, its presence heavier than ever. As I carried the final box out to the car, I glanced back at the apartment one last time. For a brief moment, I saw the shadowy figure standing in the window, its dark form a stark contrast against the sunlight streaming in. We never looked back after that day. The new apartment was brighter, warmer, and free of the oppressive energy that had plagued our previous home. Yet, the experience left a lasting impression. I often wonder about the spirit and the darker entity that lurked in that corner unit. Were they tied to the land's violent history, or had we inadvertently invited something sinister into our lives? Whatever the truth, I've learned to trust my instincts and the warnings of those wiser than myself. Though I've encountered other paranormal phenomena since then, nothing has matched the intensity of what we experienced in that apartment. It was a chapter of my life that I'll never forget, a chilling reminder of the unseen forces that can shape our reality in ways we'll never fully understand. Even after we moved out of the cursed apartment, the lingering echoes of that haunting refused to leave my mind. At first, I thought the nightmares were just remnants of the stress we'd endured. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing the phantom footsteps in my dreams, pacing in circles, stopping at the foot of my bed. I'd tell myself it was all in my head, a residual fear from the trauma of living with something so unexplainable. But soon, it became evident that the entity had left a mark on me, one far deeper than I could have anticipated. It started with small occurrences in the new apartment, a door creaking open when no one was near it, the occasional sensation of being watched, or an inexplicable chill in the air. My partner dismissed these incidents as my overactive imagination, but I could feel the truth creeping closer, clawing at the edges of my awareness. One night, I stayed up late working in our new living room. The apartment was quiet, my partner fast asleep in the bedroom. The glow of my laptop screen cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the silence. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable pressure of a presence behind me. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room. At first, I saw nothing, just the familiar shapes of furniture bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights outside. But then, in the corner of the room, a shadow moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow seemed to grow denser, more defined. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could hear a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind, yet unmistakably deliberate. "You can't escape me." The voice was guttural, layered, as if more than one being spoke in unison. I shot to my feet, knocking over the chair in my haste. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, clutching a nearby lamp as a makeshift weapon. The shadow didn't advance, it simply loomed, its presence oppressive and unyielding. Summoning every ounce of courage, I shouted, "Leave this place. You're not welcome here." The shadow seemed to hesitate, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it dissolved into the darkness, leaving me standing there, trembling and clutching the lamp like a lifeline. I didn't sleep that night, instead keeping every light in the apartment on and reciting prayers under my breath until dawn. The following day, I confided in my partner. She listened, her skepticism giving way to concern as she saw the fear etched into my face. "We need help," she said simply. "Let's call my grandmother." Her grandmother arrived the next evening, her demeanor calm yet serious. She carried an assortment of items, a bundle of sage, a bottle of holy water, and a small, ornately carved box that she refused to open. She moved through the apartment with purpose, her prayers steady and resolute. When she reached the living room, she paused, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the corner where I'd seen the shadow. "It's here," she said, her voice low. "Not as strong as before, but it's still attached to you. It feeds on your fear and the energy you give it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What can we do? How do we get rid of it?" Her grandmother looked at me, her gaze piercing. "You have to stop feeding it. Stand firm. Show it that you are not afraid, that you will not bend to its will. And you must protect yourself spiritually. This is not just a haunting, it's an attack on your soul." She performed another cleansing ritual, more elaborate than the one at the previous apartment. As she worked, I could feel the atmosphere shifting, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. But I knew this wasn't a permanent solution. The entity was weaker, yes, but it wasn't gone. It was a patient predator, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Over the next few months, I threw myself into fortifying my defenses, both physical and spiritual. I adorned the apartment with protective symbols, kept a Bible by my bedside, and made a habit of daily prayer and meditation. I also sought guidance from others who had experienced similar encounters, learning techniques to shield myself from the entity's influence. The activity gradually lessened, the entity's presence fading into the background like a faint, unwelcome memory. But I remained vigilant, knowing that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a crack in my armor. To this day, I carry the lessons of that experience with me, a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown forces that lie beyond. While life eventually returned to normal, I could never shake the feeling that the entity's attachment had changed me. I was more cautious, more attuned to the subtle energies around me. And though I've encountered other paranormal phenomena since then, I've learned to approach them with both respect and a firm resolve. Because once you've been touched by the darkness, you learn to recognize its presence, and you never forget the way it feels. As time passed, I tried to move forward, to focus on life beyond the shadows that had haunted me. The new apartment became a sanctuary, a place where the light seemed to outshine the darkness. Yet, the experience left an indelible mark on my soul, a constant reminder of the unseen world and its ever-present influence. One evening, as I was unpacking a box I had neglected since the move, I stumbled upon an item I hadn't seen in months. It was a small trinket, a gift from the previous tenant of the haunted apartment. I had initially kept it out of politeness, not thinking much of its significance. But now, as I held it in my hands, a wave of unease washed over me. The object seemed heavier than it should have been, its surface unusually cold. I debated what to do. Logic told me it was just an ordinary item, but my gut screamed otherwise. Remembering the advice of my partner's grandmother, I decided it was time to sever every last tie to that chapter of my life. That night, I drove to a secluded spot by the river, the trinket clutched tightly in my hand. Under the moonlight, I whispered a prayer of release and hurled it into the rushing water. As it disappeared beneath the surface, I felt a strange sense of closure, as though a final chain had been broken. From that moment on, the lingering disturbances ceased entirely. No more phantom footsteps, no more shadows lurking in the corners. It was as if the entity, or whatever connection it had to me, had been washed away with the current. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy. My partner and I grew closer, finding strength in the ordeal we had endured together. We spoke less and less about the haunting, choosing instead to focus on the present and the future. But every so often, in the quiet moments of the night, I would find myself reflecting on the experience. It wasn't just a story of fear and survival, it was a lesson in resilience, in the power of faith, and in the importance of confronting the things that seek to harm us. Years later, I found myself telling the story to a close friend who had an interest in the paranormal. As I recounted the events, I realized just how much I had grown since those dark days. The fear that once consumed me had been replaced by a quiet strength, a certainty that I could face whatever challenges came my way. The experience had tested me in ways I never thought possible, but it had also forged a deeper understanding of myself and the world around me. To this day, I remain cautious but open, always aware of the thin veil that separates our reality from the unknown. The haunted apartment may be a distant memory, but its lessons linger, shaping the way I navigate life and its mysteries. In a strange way, I'm grateful for the encounter. It reminded me that while the darkness may be vast and unyielding, the light within us is far stronger, a beacon that no shadow can ever truly extinguish.